But what I'm going to talk to you about really is sort of protecting the network here and looking at it from a slightly different angle and perspective that we would normally do from the inside out. Is there anybody in the audience that has not seen this defense in depth model before? Don't be shy to show your hands if you've not. What we do love within the IT world, and indeed with any kind of a system like this, is to layer things up. And these 7 layers that we're talking about here, the defense in depth, take us through the policies and the procedures all the way down through to the central core of what it is that we're trying to protect on a network, which ultimately is our data. Now, one thing that I love to do on my courses is kind of get back to basics, I suppose. And what I'm not going to do is pick on people in the audience. But what I do like to do is get people to explain and define kind of the different layers that we're talking about here. So if we're talking about data, for example, what is data? And if we start to think about stuff like that, it's very difficult, isn't it, in our world to actually determine what it is we're trying to protect if you're trying to define it to somebody. So if an alien came along and you were trying to say, I'm protecting my network here, and the reason why I'm protecting my network is to protect the data within it, and somebody asks you, what's data? Why is it worth protecting? You have to think long and hard about that. And then through the scales that we build up through here, through the layers that we build up through here, I then sort of start asking questions about, okay, so we can define data and we got a rough understanding about what that is. So what's a computer? Again, that's a difficult thing to define now as well, because computers have morphed into the things that you have in your pocket these days, right up to mainframes and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult to actually put a label onto that. And then spin that up a little bit as to, okay, so we can define what data is, we can define what the host is, the computer system that it's sitting on. So what's a network? Oddly enough, the further away from that central core we get, the easier it is to start making definitions, because as soon as you understand what data is and how it sits on an IT system, you can then spin that out a little bit. So as we get further and further through the rings here, it's a lot easier to start getting definitions through this defense in depth model. But from a technical point of view, if we're looking at what we're defending ourselves from, it's very easy to get kind of embroiled in the fact that all of these attacks are coming from the outside. So instantly, and again, it's quite a natural thing to do, is that when we're looking at the main threats to our network and therefore to the central core, which is our data, we start kind of listing these areas, I suppose, really. It's hard not to, especially given press announcements and everything that's happening really on the outside. So hackers, and again, we could be here talking all day about what type of attacks we're talking about here from the hacking side of things, but hacking is just unauthorized access. Okay, that's effectively what that is. I am a hacker. It's almost like being an alcoholic stood in front of you saying, here I am. I'm taking some medication for it, but I am, from time to time, allowed to, on my internal network, to make unauthorized access in order to sort a problem out, for example. If I do that for malicious reasons, then I wear a different colour hat, for example, and that's what it's down to. But the word hacking and hacker is synonymous with evil doing from the outside, I suppose. And then we get into things like man in the middle. You could argue that, well, if you hacked, then effectively that could be tantamount to a man in the middle type of attack, denial of service, and of course, the production of malware. And again, I don't really need to talk to you about what these things are and the types of attack that we're going to be defending our network and ultimately defending our data about. But if you keep those in mind and start thinking about the defense of your network. So here, has anybody learned anything yet? No. Good. If you have a look at this list, you can see that there are a variety of technical controls that I can put into place as well. And when I ask my delegates, when I ask my students in the classroom, okay, defend that network, nearly 80-90% of the time, firewall is the first thing that comes into their minds, and it's the first answer they come up with, which is not a bad answer and not a bad response. But what does a firewall protect you against? Ultimately, we're talking about the layers there in the defense model. It's kind of coming from the outside in. It's very, very true that a firewall will go the other way. You're not learning anything, are you? And so here, when we're starting to layer in firewalls, IDSs and IPSs, we are monitoring a two-way flow of data, not only from the outside in, but from the inside out. Okay, and good protection systems do just that. And again, from the layered defense mechanisms that we're putting into place, there are loads of fancy management systems that I can put into place. But in most cases, people are looking at defense from the outside rather than the other way around. Like I said, I like to get back to basics when it comes to networking security. And there are a couple of fundamentals, a couple of basics that I always like to quote. And generally, if you come onto one of my courses, I get you to quote these, and woe betide you if you get them wrong after a week of trying to learn about network defense. So the first one states that all systems should be well maintained and patched at all times, and unnecessary unwanted applications or programs should be removed. Okay, it's a fairly standard arrangement, and indeed anybody within IT networking security could have a t-shirt printed with this on, because it's rule number one. Okay, nothing new here. The other part of this then, all software and equipment should be functionally tested before joining a network. And again, there's plenty of ways of doing that. Okay, this is especially important if your network has any kind of external connectivity to it. So again, standalone systems, it's very true to say, should also follow this mantra. But if it's going out onto a network, internal or external, then this is the fundamental basic requirement, number one. And again, right at the bottom, you can see that this is relatively easy to implement and should really be commonplace to us. However, it's not always the case, is it? You don't have to cast your mind too far back. Globally, even though the UK was one of the focuses, obviously, that we looked at, was the fact that older, unpatched, not quite so well managed systems were tantamount to malware intrusion just last year, in fact, with the ransomware being quite rife on those kind of systems. And then when we're looking at the data, protection of the data, no security course would be complete without somebody mentioning confidentiality, integrity, and the availability of your network and or indeed the data. So the CIA is one of those security triads that we constantly beat home about. And we know this, so data should be protected at all times. We either have a legal requirement to do that, well, we always have a legal requirement to do that, and it should be backed up regularly. We also know that. But once again, unfortunately, you just cast your mind back not too long ago, where backup solutions are not in place, so systems cannot be recovered properly, leading to either leakage or unnecessary downtime. And the third part of this is what we call the need to know and hold principle. And again, if there's anybody in the military that's ever dealt with classified information, once again, I remember this as a young airman having to stand on a chair and recite this until such times that I got it right. Okay, the knowledge and or possession of data, and it used to be classified information, should be strictly limited to those who need it in order to conduct their duties. And again, this is another t-shirt that you could wear when we're looking at the data protection side of things. So with these kind of fundamentals in place, it's a relatively straightforward thing, one would assume then, to be looking at patch management systems, maintaining systems, updating systems, remaining as compliant as you possibly can with the manufacturer's specs, functionally testing stuff before it comes onto your network equipment, okay, and going through common criteria, for example, to make sure that it meets with the minimum specs for joining your network. Backups. No real reason why we should not be completing and maintaining regular backups these days, either internally or externally. And indeed at the bottom one, then we can put access control measures in place to do just that. Which is why at a conference that I attended in the UK, in Manchester earlier this year, there were a couple of stats, a couple of presentations that I pick up from that. And I love numbers, and I appreciate the fact that stats can be interpreted in several different ways. That this was again taken from UK companies for 2017, okay, and I have the numbers in front of me, that show that when questioned from around UK companies, they looked at the fact that 89% of companies questioned said that they were fairly happy with the fact that they had an adequate firewall in place when it came to the defense of the network. 79% had adequate access control methods in place, which if I go back to my defense in depth layer, we're looking at the outer rings of that defense in depth. Cutting all the way through the 7 layers, however, are the policies and the procedures, which you can see here, a 33, so just about a third of businesses queried in here, questioned, said that they had a formal security policy in place. 20% had an adequate user training and awareness program, and 11% had an incident management plan in place. Technical controls, access control, firewalls, IDSs and IPSs, reasonably good, safe and sound. However, when it comes to the policies and the procedures that are behind these, and the policy in particular here is user training and awareness, we then start to fall way short of where we should be at. Out of these businesses, 46% formally reported that they had a breach in 2017. So it's nearly half of them reported a breach. And those are the ones that reported. Of course, the number in reality is probably higher than that. These numbers were taken from a different source. Again, this is up into this year, in fact. And so 90%, and this is worldwide, in fact, of organisations recognise that there is a risk from the inside. Here I'm talking about our own users. 50% of organisations, so it's a very similar number to the stats that we had previously in here, have reported some form of insider incident. Now, here we're not necessarily talking about things that are malicious. Of course, so I'm not talking about hackers, I'm not talking about wrongdoing on the inside. And if you have a little look at the list, in fact, you can see that the main threat areas in here, so my main risks, indeed are from, dare I say it, slack administration. I'm not talking about rogue administrators here, I'm talking about people not doing their jobs properly or cutting corners, which is what we like to do. Because at the end of the day, we are only human. Lack of user awareness, okay, which takes me back to user awareness and training policies, which appear to be sadly lacking on our organisations. Yeah, you could argue that external contractors and disgruntled employees, those are malicious. Okay, if you've got a disgruntled employee, if you've got somebody rogue on the inside, that's very, very difficult to defend against. Accidental denial of service, that could be something as simple as tripping over a cable and pulling it out, or spilling your tea onto your desktop. How do you defend against that? Well, there are policies and procedures you can put into place, okay, that allow you to at least mitigate some of the risk involved in those kind of activities. And again, when we're talking about disclosure, malware introduction, then we can start to move that up a little further. So we go back to basics. What we like to do, what I like to do, especially when I'm talking about on my Microsoft courses, is that we talk about a user object and a computer object. If I'm looking after a network, if I'm a systems administrator, I tend not to differentiate between the two. Okay, in fact, I do differentiate between the two because I love computer objects and I generally dislike user objects. Because on my network, a network of computer objects never goes wrong until you introduce a user object into it. It's a sad fact of life. The unfortunate thing is, if I follow the CIA of security, I can give you 100% confidentiality. I can give you 100% integrity, but that's maintaining 0% availability. So it's switched off and the user is never going to turn it on. As soon as the user switches it on, I can no longer give you 100% of the C and I can no longer give you 100% of the I. It's just a sad fact of life. We know that every single measure that we put into place, we are still going to leak. Incidents are still going to happen. Okay, so there is no such thing as a 100% secure network. So how do you keep your user well maintained and patched at all times? Wouldn't that be lovely? Okay, if you could just plug one in and it gets an update once every Thursday afternoon or something like that. Okay, and how do you functionally test a user before it joins your network? And again, the key word here is policy, isn't it? Okay, and User training and awareness, that's another T-shirt that I'd be wearing all the time, in fact, because that's a big thing. And the part of the reason why when I deliver my training is that I like my technicians and my analysts to be able to define stuff, is because we love talking about jargon, we love abbreviations, and we love to impress people with our knowledge of IT systems. However, what we don't understand and appreciate is the fact that the users on our network hate all of that stuff. They are not computer literate, they don't love computers like we do, or IT systems, and nor do they really understand them like we do, because it's our work to do that. So what I like to do is to get people to stand up, or in fact write reports without using any kind of jargon. Explain to me what it is. Explain to me why you are defending your network, and explain to me what the risk is and what the threat is to my network in simple terms. Because at the end of the day, that's how you're then going to put a good user training and awareness program together, by explaining to the people on the shop floor exactly where the risk is, where the threats are coming from, and what that means to them in the workplace. Okay. Once they are aware, they need to be maintained in that as well. So again, this is a round of training. This is a round of meetings that you can put together. And there are several different ways of doing it, several different strategies that you can put into place. Not just when a user joins your network. So it's not just an induction training policy, although those are very important, because that's invariably when you get them to sign off and say, yes, they will adhere to the company security policy, acceptable usage policies, and so on and so forth. But that's a one-time event on most networks. It may mean, of course, that you're going back and you may be using some kind of disciplinary policy to put into place. But how many of us have got acceptable usage policies that we don't enforce? A lot of networks do that, okay? And so really that means that they're not really worth the paper that they're written on. And then if we're looking at how do you functionally test a user before it joins your network, here we're talking about recruiting policies. We're talking about the hiring and firing side of life, okay? And so a lot of us who have worked on, for me, an example, working on military networks and secure networks, constantly being updated and had to be signed on to different networks as they came in place. And that was, of course, monitored and audited throughout my time on the network. And that's where I then throw it back over to our auditors, because that has to obviously be a routine, regular occurrence. Okay, and so an accounting policy is put into place. And when it comes to auditing, there is also the danger that we over-audit, okay, which then starts to negate the whole reason for doing it. We can put auditing policies as a technical control in place on file systems, file servers, and elsewhere across the network, and also, of course, on IT systems to actually see who's coming on and what they're up to. But with that, it doesn't necessarily have to be Big Brother is watching you kind of thing, because then that starts to work against us a little bit when we're talking about the user side of things. Jokingly then, how do you keep a user backed up? Well, again, a lot of us, I can remember from my military days when there was a single person who was responsible for a single function, and that could have created an unnecessary denial of service if that single person didn't show up for work in the morning, or something untoward had happened to them on the way to work. And I see this time and time again. I'm constantly talking to people who, especially in the military, unfortunately, who have got, if you like, more power on the network. And should their expertise and knowledge be removed from that network, then there's going to be a shortfall in operations. If you are a small network, it's very difficult to not have those kind of areas where you have an expert, you have a subject matter expert, or a technician that is keen on the database, but not so keen on the operating system side of things, for example. And we tend to sort of focus that without spreading the load across our network when it comes to the users who are responsible for these activities. And so you can see here that I've listed a couple of policies which are put into place here, such as separation of duties and job rotation. There's another one that we talk about, which is mandatory vacation, which is always a bit of an odd policy that we put into place then. But from an auditing point of view, it's great, absolutely superb. Access control policies, well, technically those are technical controls. And here I'm talking about access control lists, permissions, if you will, on your file servers and databases, for example. But how often do we review them? Okay, and again, I know that I'm talking to people that audit these things from an external point of view, but internally, that should be something that we are partly doing routinely and reporting up. One of the key areas where we let ourselves down, however, rather than access control, is escalation privileges, and this happens a lot. How many of you could go back onto your networks and look at the service desk personnel and tell them what kind of administrative level that they have? Smaller networks, larger networks, we're all culpable to the fact that we default to being lazy. Okay, it's a human trait. If there's a short path to success, we will take it. And again, from a hacking point of view, I love that, because if I'm trying to undermine your network by using social engineering techniques, I will go for the lazy aspect for a user. Click on this link to sort your computer out, for example. Okay, loads of ways of doing that. Is anybody aware of restricted groups, which is in a technical control that you can put into place within Active Directory, which is a group policy setting which allows you to control which administrators are within which administrative groups. And this is a very simple, effective technical control that you can put into place. If you go back onto your service desk, for example, how many of them are domain administrators when they don't need to be? If all they're doing is resetting users' passwords and making members of a group, for example, which requires the least amount of administrative privileges on a network, okay, until such times as they have earned their spurs, got the training, okay, and started to go through that process of becoming a domain administrator. But it's the easiest thing in the world to have a domain administrative group and put all of my administrators into it. What restricted groups does, in fact, is removes them if they're not actually within the group policy object themselves. So even though I may have administrators that are doing that, every 30 seconds they are removed to the point where it becomes ineffective. How often do we review those administrative groups on a network? And the answer is, quite simply, not very often at all. Okay, who looks after that as well? So whose job is it to actually review administrative groups, and in particular, the escalation side of things? Now, escalation of privileges doesn't just rest with administrators, it's very true. This is also something that is tantamount to what access control users have. And again, I come from a background of classified data. I had a security clearance which allowed me to see a certain level, but that didn't mean that I could also see other businesses or other parts of the department's top secret stuff, for example. So no read across. And again, all of those things should be put into place, but those are technical controls that we can use. I'm kind of hoping that you haven't learned anything from this, which is, like I said at the start, a very strange way to design any kind of course. Okay, but the key thrust, I suppose, of what I'm presenting to you is that the fact that we can talk all day about the technical, the physical controls that we can put into place, but they're of no use to us whatsoever if we're not putting in the correct procedural controls, and the policies are probably more important, in fact, than a lot of the stuff that we put in, which is the Gucci stuff. If you talk to a technician, all they want to do is IDSs and firewalls. They want to have nothing at all to do with the procedures and the policies that are put into place behind them. But these are the experts. These are the people that we need to get on board for our teams to make sure that they have an input to it. Okay, and again, they're only effective if everybody is on board. So here I'm talking about top management down. How many of us can say with our hands on our heart that if we had a user training and an awareness session where we're talking about threats and risks, that the CEO would come? Okay, but their presence at these meetings goes a long way to everybody else being on board. And again, it has to be a routine, regular occurrence. And again, how many of us have got top-level management that feel that the policies and the procedures don't apply to them? They need to have a non-expiring password. They don't need to change their password every 6 months. They can't be bothered to remember a password which has got 15 characters in it, randomly generated and complex. So they have a 5-digit password which they never change. Okay, this stuff still happens. Okay, those are the vulnerabilities on our network. Okay, these are the things. If I flick back to the slide where hackers are coming in, those are the vulnerabilities I'm looking for. In particular, I'm looking at the vulnerability of a user who will default to effectively lazy and ignorant. Now, I don't use those words in a nasty way. Okay, I mean those words in the way that we could all look at ourselves and think, do you know what? That's what I default to, because it's human nature, first and foremost, to trust something that's coming to you, especially if it's in the form of an email. And I will always take the easiest path to success. Okay, if it's just simply clicking on a link or cutting a corner when it comes to my network, I will do that. Okay, because it's just human nature to do just that. Policies and procedures need to be in place to prevent that from happening. Like I said, hopefully you haven't learned anything from that, but I'm quite happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Where do you start with all of this? If you've got a network as a network administrator, or you're even worse, a manager from a bunch of administrators, how do you start your plan to defend a network?
The first thing is that you've got to get everybody on board. So from that point of view, you would need your network administrators on board, and that's where user training and awareness starts. So the administrators themselves, of course, have to be properly trained, okay, and they have to be aware, because the leak comes in. We've all been on a network where the old boy teaches a new boy then teaches the next new boy, and so it goes on. And so all we're doing is we're passing from generation to generation bad habits, effectively. We've all been there. We've all done that. And again, it's a great question, because I do a lot of systems administration courses from my Microsoft hat, and sometimes I'm sat with an audience such as I'm faced today, with a lot of experience, a lot of depth of knowledge and experience. And on the Sunday evening when we start the course, there's always a little bit of worry in the fact of what am I going to teach these boys and girls, because they've been on a network for a long time. And it's amazing how quickly, when we start to get back into fundamentals and basics from sort of day one, how everyone is then, the lights are going on saying, well, we've never done that. And the reason why they've never done that is because they never knew how to do it properly in the first place. Now, again, a lot of that can be put down to tongue-in-cheek. And again, from a Microsoft point of view, I'm not damning Microsoft, because Microsoft have their own way of doing it. But generally speaking, when we're looking at the way that the vendors have developed these training packages and the way that they look after their network, there's nowhere finer than Microsoft to tell us how Active Directory works, for example. And so when they come and get trained properly, that's where it all comes into place. Once they are on board, so effectively we're going from the middle out from that, then we need to get senior management on board. So that's when you would then get your CISO, if your organisation has them, data protection officers. Everybody who comes from a non-technical background has to come to the fray. It doesn't have to be a big team. It doesn't have to be a big team. And then spinning it down to the user level, section heads are then on board as well. So, and again, they will then know how their users are going to respond, how their colleagues are going to respond to training packages, user training and awareness programs, and so on and so forth.
Can I ask about this explanation? What is information security, what is cyber security, and especially how they are connected?
Well, they're kind of interconnected, I suppose, really. So when we're looking at cybersecurity, what does that mean to you? What does cybersecurity actually mean to you?
Information security, cybersecurity.
Yeah, and again, so this is where we're using this term cyber, I suppose, really, that cuts across anything at all to do with an IT system. So your question was, how are they interrelated, or?
Yeah, how they are interrelated, how to explain.
That's a very good question, and I don't have the answer for you. The reason why is because there is always going to be some ambiguity between what is information security and what is cyber security. So from a data point of view, when we're looking at data protection, for example, it's the way that an attack is, I suppose, mounted from the cybersecurity space that we're looking at, really, and then crossing over into the fact that how are we then protecting the information from the inside of our network out. And that's probably the best that I can give you. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.